Hi and welcome back to the History of Russia podcast. This is episode 1, The Slavs, part 1 of what will be a 3-part episode looking at the Slavs. The Slavs are, according to some historians, the least documented group amongst the so-called barbarian enemies of Rome during late antiquity, so unfortunately there is no scholarly consensus regarding their origin. Authors who have written about the Slavs do not agree, to put it mildly. Some say the Slavs were nomads, others claim they lived in permanent settlements located in forests and swamps. Some accounts say they lived under the rule of a king, whilst others say they embraced a form of democracy. In addition to these discrepancies, we must bear in mind that most of these accounts are filled with the bias of the Romans, who saw all barbarian people as primitive, uncivilized and violent. Based on the little evidence to hand, we do know that the Proto-Slavic peoples were already active by 1500 BCE from western Poland through to the Dnieper River in southern Belarus, northern Ukraine. To me at least, it seems more reasonable to consider a wider territory in which a common cultural trait was shared by its inhabitants. Linguistic evidence suggests that at some stage during their early times, the territory of the Slavs reached into the western region of Russia and the southern Russian steppes, where they then came into contact with Iranian-speaking groups. This is based on the Slavic language shared a striking number of words with the Iranian languages, which can be explained through the diffusion from Iranian into Slavic. Later in time, as they moved westward, they came into contact with Germanic tribes and again borrowed several additional terms from Germanic languages. Interestingly, some academics have noticed that in all Slavic languages, the words for beech, larch and yew are borrowed from foreign languages, which implies that during early times, these type of trees were unknown to the Slavs, a suggestion that could be used as a clue to determine where the Slavic culture originated. Some historians have suggested this points towards the Pripyat, or as it's sometimes known, Pinsk marshes. I understand the names are interchangeable for the wide geographic area which covers southwest Belarus and northern Ukraine, an area where these trees do not and cannot grow. It's also important to note that this could be a happy coincidence. Peoples, cultures and nations have been borrowing words from other cultures since the dawn of history. It is not a conclusive proof that this is the origin of these people, but it is an interesting fact nonetheless. So let's rewind it back a step. The early Slavs were a diverse group of tribal societies who lived during the migration period. This is a name given to a period of history that historians use to refer to the 4th to the 8th century of the Common Era, where a multitude of different peoples migrated into the Roman sphere of Western and Southern Europe from further afield. And the early Middle Ages, approximately from the 5th to the 10th centuries in Eastern Europe, and established the foundations for the Slavic nations through the Slavic states of the High Middle Ages. The first written use of the name of the Slavs dates to the 6th century, when the Slavic tribes inhabited a large portion of Central and Eastern Europe. By that century, native Iranian ethnic groups such as the Scythians, the Sarmatians and the Alans had been absorbed into the region's Slavic population. Over the next 2 centuries, the Slavs expanded southwest towards the Balkans and the Alps, and northeast towards the Volga River. At some point during this time frame, the Slavs splintered into those peoples in the west, and that would create the states of Poland and Bohemia, and the south to occupy the Balkans, and the east to occupy the areas of Belarus, Ukraine, and of course, Russia. Early Slavic archaeological findings are most often associated with the Przeworsk and Treblinski cultures, with evidence ranging from hill forts, ceramic pots, weapons, jewellery and abodes. However, in many areas, archaeologists face difficulties in distinguishing Slavic and non-Slavic findings, as the early Slavic culture of the subsequent centuries was heavily influenced by the Sarmatian culture from the east and the various Germanic cultures in the west. There have been theories attempting to place the Slavic origin in the Near East, but these have mainly been discarded. None of the proposed homelands reach the Volga River in the east, over the Dinaric Alps in the southwest, or the Balkan Mountains in the south, or past Bohemia in the west. Frederick Coulthard, who's a noted Dutch linguistics professor, has suggested that the number of candidates for Slavic homeland may rise from a tendency among historians to date, and I quote, proto-languages farther back in time that is warranted by the linguistic evidence, end quote. Although all spoken languages change gradually over time, in the absence of written records, that change can be identified by historians only after a population has expanded and separated long enough to develop daughter languages. The existence of an original home is sometimes rejected as arbitrary because the earliest origin sources, and again I quote, always speak of origins and beginnings in a manner which presupposes earlier origins and beginnings, end quote. According to historical records, the Slavic homeland would have been somewhere in Central Europe, possibly along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea. The Prague, Penkova, Kolochian complex of cultures during the 6th and 7th century CE is generally accepted to reflect the expansion of Slavic speakers at the time. Other core candidates are the territories of modern Belarus, Poland and Ukraine. According to Polish historian Jarad Labuda, the earliest records of Slavic people is the Tringic culture from about 1700 to 1200 BCE, whilst the Milograd culture hypothesis posits that the pre-Proto-Slavs, or the Balto-Slavs as they're referred to in that document, originated in the 7th century BCE, that is the area that now makes up the modern Baltic states. As you can see from the examples that I've run through, and there's many more theories you can find online, post a disclaimer, a warning on the Venetti rabbit hole. This is a fiercely debated subject of history, and one at this time that does not have a universally accepted theory. Proto-Slavic began to evolve from Proto-Indo-European, which is a language from which a number of languages spoken in Eurasia today originated. Slavic languages share a number of features with Baltic languages, which may indicate a common Proto-Balto-Slavic phase in the development of the two Indo-European linguistic branches. Going back to Frederick Courtauld, he places the territory of this common language near the Indo-European homeland, and to quote, "The Indo-Europeans who remained after the migrations became speakers of Balto-Slavic. However, geographical features, parallel development and interaction may explain the existence of these language group characteristics." Scholars believe that Proto-Slavic developed into a separate language during the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE. The Proto-Slavic vocabulary, inherited by its daughter languages, described its speakers' physical and social environments and its feelings and needs. Proto-Slavic had words for family connections, including shverki, which means husband's mother, and splili, which means sister-in-law. Inherited common Slavic vocabulary lacks detailed terminology for physical surface features peculiar to mountains or the steppe, the sea, coastal features, literal flora or fauna, or indeed saltwater fish. Proto-Slavic hydronyms have been preserved between the source of the Vistula and the middle basin of the Dnieper. Its northern regions adjoin territory where river names of Baltic origin, for example the Gvuva, Nieman and others, abound. On the south and east it borders the Iranian river names, including, for example, the Dniester, Dnieper and Don. A connection between Proto-Slavic and Iranian languages is also demonstrated by the earliest layer of loanwords in the former. The Proto-Slavic words for god, biog, demon, divi, house, yata, axe, and shopri, and dog, sobaka, are of Scythian origin. The Iranian dialects of the Scythians and Dalmatians influenced Slavic vocabulary during the millennium-long contact between them and early Proto-Slavic. A longer, more intensive connection between Proto-Slavic and the Germanic languages can be assumed from the number of Germanic loanwords. For example, Duma, which means thought, and kapiti, which means to buy. The common Slavic words for beech, larch and yew, as mentioned earlier, were also borrowed from Germanic. This led Polish botanist Józef Rosywiński to place the Slavic homeland in the Pripyat marshes. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is where these trees are missing from, so it's assumed if the Slavs didn't need or didn't have a use of these words, that's why they've incorporated it from another language. Let's take a look at the early historical records. Perhaps the earliest reference to Slavs, although at this time called Galvanese, comes from Jordanes, Procopius and other late Roman authors who provide the probable earliest references to what is now recognised as being Southern Slavs in the second half of the 6th century. Jordanes completed his Gothic history, which was an abridgment of Cassiodorus' longer work in Constantinople in 550 or possibly 551. Jordanes wrote that Venethis, Galvanes and Antes were names referring to the same groups and tribes of people. His claim was accepted for more than a millennium by large swaths of the academic community, who searched for the Slavic homeland in the lands with the Venethi, a people that was also named in Tacitus's Germania, lived during the last decades of the 1st century. Pliny the Elder wrote that territory extended from the Vistula to the Arnesia, was inhabited by the Smati, the Wends, the Sikiri and Hiri. Procopius completed his 3 works on Emperor Justinian I's reign. They were named Buildings, History of the Wars, and Secret History during the 550s. Each book contained detailed information on the reigns by Scalvanes and Antes on the Eastern Roman Empire, and the History of the Wars has a comprehensive description of their beliefs, customs, and dwellings. Although not an eyewitness, Procopius had contacts among the Scalvani mercenaries who were fighting on the Roman side in Italy. Agreeing with Jordanus' report, Procopius wrote that the Scalvanes and Antes spoke the same languages but traced the common origin not to the Veneti but to a people he called Sporoi. Sporoi means seeds in Greek, compared with the English word spores. It is equivalent to the Latin Semnones and Germani, germs or seedlings. That German linguist Jacob Grimm believed that Suebi meant Slav. Jordanus and Procopius called the Suebi Suavi. So you can see that there's a lot of confusion here regarding the naming conventions, and this is particularly confusing as the Suebi were a large Germanic confederation of tribes that would eventually settle in the Iberian Peninsula following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. You can also find a similar description of the Scalvanes and Antes in the Strategon of Maurice, a military handbook that's very famous, that was written between 592 and 602. Its author, an experienced officer, participated in the Eastern Roman campaigns against the Scalvanes on the lower Danube at the end of the century. And sorry for the inconsistencies in the naming here, I know I'm switching between Byzantine and Eastern Roman. For anybody that isn't aware, I am referring to the same group of people. The Eastern Roman Empire is also known as the Byzantine Empire. Although Martin of Braga was the first Western author to refer to a people known as Sclavus, before 580, Jonas of Bobbio, including the earliest lengthy record of the nearby Slavs in his Life of St. Columbanus, wrote between 639 and 643. Jonas referred to the Slavs here as Veneti. Martin notes that they were also known as Sclavi. Western authors, including Frederigar and Boniface, preserved the term Veneti. The Franks, in the Life of St. Martinus, the Chronicle of Frederigar and Gregory of Tours, Lombards under Paul the Deacon, and the Anglo-Saxons under Winsith, referred to Slavs in the Elbe-Salo region and Pomerania as Venden, or Vinden. Again, this is probably where the term Vends comes from. The Franks and Bavarians of Styria and Carinthia called the Slavic neighbours Vindici. The unknown author of the Chronicle of Frederigar used the word Venedi to refer to a group of Slavs who were subjugated by the Avars, the Avars being a nomadic steppe tribe. In the Chronicle, Venedi, which formed a state which emerged from a revolt led by the Frankish merchant Samo against the Avars around the year 623. A change in terminology, the appearance of Slavic tribal names instead of the collective Scalvins and Antanes occurred at the end of this century. The first tribal names were recorded in the second book of the Miracles of St. Demetrius around 690. According to Florin Curta, the change indicates pre-existing differences among Slavic groups, although Scalveni may have originally been the name of a particular ethnic group or tribe. It became purely a Byzantine construct, an umbrella term for various groups living north of the Danube frontier, which were neither Antes nor Huns or Avars according to him. The unknown Bavarian geographer listed Slavic tribes in the Frankish Empire around 840, and a detailed description of the 10th century tribes in the Balkan Peninsula was compiled under the supervision of Emperor Constantine VII in Constantinople around the year 950. As we bring this episode to its conclusion, I think it's important to note that this is a really contested topic. I can really appreciate it seems garbled and confused, because that's exactly what it is. There's no definitive explanation of who these people are, where they came from, and a number of sources debate fiercely on who's right and who's wrong. I've even seen some sources suggest the Veneti, which as the name suggests are a people that occupied northeastern Italy, were also a Slavic tribe. Now, this doesn't sound too far-fetched, as it's next door to modern-day Slovenia. However, they're talking about the Veneti tribe that occupied this area in the 5th century BCE. This really illustrates just how varied opinions of historians are on this particular subject. Now, thanks again for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed it, and even if you didn't, I'd really love to read and see your feedback. If you could leave me a review on iTunes, it would be very much appreciated. Not only will this help the channel grow, but it will help me in terms of how I present the topic, and will ultimately improve future episodes. Lastly, if you want to help out with the running costs of the show, especially now as we're entering the historical period and more sources become available, many of which are locked behind paywalls or need to be purchased in the form of textbooks, I would really appreciate it if you could head over onto Patreon and consider sponsoring the show. You can find us on Patreon under the Russian History Podcast, where you can then become a member and you can receive bonuses such as the show transcripts and episodes on demand. By that I mean you can receive the episodes as and when they're recorded, rather than waiting for the weekly releases the wider public will do. Also, feel free to contact me directly on the russianhistorypodcast@gmail.com. That email address again is the russianhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And if you can spare the time, again, I would really love it if you could leave us a review on iTunes. Okay, thanks again. Bye for now.